Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful. Greetings of peace, and welcome to the third and final round of these Catholic-Shi'a dialogues hosted by the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, part of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. I'm Mahan Mirza, Executive Director of the Ansari Institute, and I'm delighted to be here with this distinguished international panel, moderated by two of our esteemed faculty fellows and affiliates, Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds, Jerome J. Crowley and Rosaline G. Crowley Professor of Theology, and Dr. Azra Banafsheh Keinoush, who came up with the vision for these dialogues and is leading their implementation. The theme of today's dialogue is geopolitics. Both our moderators will also serve as participants. Dr. Banafsheh as an expert in the field and with a recent book on the Abraham Accords, and Professor Reynolds with his expertise in theology and experience as a member of the Pontifical Council of Interreligious Dialogue. You may view our first two dialogue sessions. The first one was a framing, which we called a dialogue on dialogue. And the second was an engaged conversation on gender. And these are available on our website. Today's dialogue on geopolitics cannot be more timely. Last week, President Trump surprised the world by announcing direct peace talks with Iran. The United States and Iran met in Muscat, Oman this past Saturday, April 12, 2025. By all accounts, the talks went well, and the two parties have agreed to meet again. In a world rife with bluster and war, death and destruction, it is good to see constructive diplomacy. To be sure, the United States and Iran are not synonymous with Catholic and Shia. But it is undeniable that Shia geopolitics has been at play in a big way in the modern Middle East. While today's dialogue may touch upon recent developments and current affairs, we hope for a much deeper conversation around scripture and tradition, society and institutions, and international law. Before handing it over to our participant moderators to introduce the panel, let me thank Rebecca Go for helping us to organize these dialogues at the Ansari Institute, and Tim Checkley at the Keough School for his support behind the scenes. With that, Banafsheh and Gabriel, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, our time to everyone. Good evening, if it is your time. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, our panelists especially, and Dr. Mirza for sponsoring this dialogue series. This will be the last of the 3 dialogues that we have had to date. Behind the scenes, I also want to extend my gratitude to Rebecca Go and Tim. Today, as you know, we are talking about the relevance of theology and geopolitics. It's a very timely topic, as Dr. Mirza mentioned. And I'd like to invite our panelists, which also include the moderators, myself included, and Dr. Reynolds, to discuss 3 important questions very briefly so that we can then open the floor for Q&A and for further engagements. So with your permission, I'll start with the first question, and I will proceed to ask it from our 2 invited guests, which is, what, in your opinion, are the resources in scripture and tradition, that is the Quran, or in the Hadith, or the life of the imams or Bible, and church teachings, or even natural law, that orient Shia and Catholic thinkers in their understanding of geopolitics? And with this question, I'd like to invite first Amelia to please say a few words, followed by Abbas.
Thank you very much for this question. Banafsheh is definitely a big question, a deep question. I think, first of all, what I would like to add, that in the context of the Catholic thought and the Islamic legal tradition, we need to think of those 2 big bodies of thought and law in a very expensive way, very extensive way. It's very easy to say, well, in the context of the Islamic legal tradition, which is my focus, we need to go to the Quran or Sunnah or fiqh. And in the Catholic tradition, we perhaps need to go to the Bible, teachings of natural law, or other sources, canon law. But I think it's important to place both of those traditions in the context of modern global order and in the context of modern international law. In a way, both of those traditions relate to the UN Charter, to Article 33, that calls for instance, for peaceful resolution of disputes. It says that states must resolve their disputes peacefully. It gives a list of multiplicity of methods available to resolve those disputes in a peaceful way, such as negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and adjudication. So I think as we together today look at the understanding of geopolitics and the Shia and Catholic thinkers and sources in that context, I think it's useful to put those two traditions in the relationship with the global order and its normative framework, which is international law. In the context of Catholic tradition, I want to be very attentive to what John Paul II said about war and about geopolitics. John Paul II, as we know, he was a fellow citizen of Poland. So this is why I would like to draw on his thought. And he says that war can be avoided by international law, honest dialogue, solidarity between states, the noble exercise of diplomacy. And I think that in those times, perhaps even more than ever, we need to draw those constructive links between religious traditions and international law, as the Pope recognized. And in the same way, the Islamic legal tradition has a huge emphasis on justice. And international law is part of that justice, part of global justice. Once I was speaking with one of Muslim judges on the International Court of Justice, and he said, Emilia, just as in Christianity, you focus on law, in Islam, the focus is on justice. So I think as we continue this constructive dialogue, we need to, again, to repeat, focus on how the Islamic legal and faith tradition and Catholic thought relates to justice and international law.
Thank you very much, Amelia. I want to introduce Dr. Amelia Powell to our audience who may not be familiar with her work. She's a distinguished professor of political science and a concurrent professor of law at the University of Notre Dame, where Dr. Reynolds and I and Dr. Mirza are based as well. She has written extensively not only on international law, but is also considered a person who has done extensive work on Islam and the relevance of international law within different faith systems, of which she's spoken of today about Catholicism. I really enjoyed your emphasis on justice and the different conceptions, or perhaps the different points of views of how the question of justice is approached time and again in my own interactions with the leaders in the Islamic world. I too have noticed that while they like to abide by the principles of international law, they believe that they live in a world system in which this legal system as well is not so favorable to the countries of the South, including basically all of the countries in the developing world and the Muslim countries. And so some have spoken of the need to shift the paradigms of justice and relook at the concept of justice. So with that said, I'd like to invite our second speaker, Dr. Abbas Barzagar, to say a few words about this question. Dr. Barzagar is a scholar at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding and an assistant professor of Islam at Georgia State University. He received his PhD in religious studies from Emory University. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you to the Institute for the invitation. And just a point of clarification, my current affiliation is as a research fellow at George Mason's Center for Global Islamic Studies. Now, just a question about Islam and Shiite tradition in particular and geopolitics really goes to the core of a number of debates within the Shiite tradition itself and touches upon what we might consider in contemporary discussions, the subject of political theology and sovereignty and fundamental questions about what constitutes sovereignty and law in the sort of worldly order that we're in. And the sources upon which classical and contemporary Shiite discourse draw upon are important to highlight. And it's important to talk about those sources and those traditions. I would like to just introduce, and I hope we can get into it further in the discussion, but I'd like to just introduce it in two ways, and that is the substance and the structure of these sources and these traditions. And the first is the substance. So if one is looking from a sort of academic point of view or sort of outside of the tradition and looking in, it's very easy to identify bodies of literature. These would be Hadith, these would be tafsir, Quran, this would be the lives of the imams, etc. And think about this as a reservoir of resources in which theologians are drawing upon or leaders are drawing upon in order to sort of craft theology. And we might be tempted in many ways to draw upon that substance to encourage leaders or to engage leaders on certain kinds of themes. This is the substance. And I would like just to note, one of the most fundamental pieces of authoritative tradition within Shiite scholarship and Shiite culture is the letter to Malik al-Ashtar, who was Imam Ali's governor in Egypt when he had the confrontation with Muawiyah's army there. This is a famous letter that talks about just governance and the importance to be just, not just to the people, but also to God and God's rights. And I think one of the things that is easy for us to do is to talk about justice in a sort of worldly sense, but starting from an Islamic position, justice first belongs to God. Our accountabilities are to God first. And so the sovereignty and the locus of sovereignty is upon God and our relationship to him through a divinely sanctioned Sharia and interpretive tradition. And so although justice might seem as a kind of nodal point in which people can come together, the definition of that justice is largely different, because if we have an international legal order that understands law to be grounded within natural law, human rights law, or even just sort of state laws and the jurisdictions therein, we have to understand Islamic tradition writ large, in particular the Shiite tradition, on how justice is grounded within the sovereignty of God first. And I think that oftentimes it's easy for us to just jump right over that and say, okay, we have justice in common, let's pursue that. But I do believe the political theological question around sovereignty is important to address here. And so that's in terms of substance. We have Quran, we have Sunnah, and we have the lives of the imams, etc. And about the lives of the imams, we should talk a bit about the quietist and activist tradition a little bit further down. Now, the second point is around the structure. And this is where I think we really do need to pay more attention as academics and outsiders engaging the Muslim world and Muslim traditions. When we talk about the structure or tradition of interpretation, we really need to pay attention to what those authoritative institutions are in practice on the ground on a day-to-day basis, and not simply the thematic areas that we believe might be resonating for our purposes or for larger themes. And what I mean here is, both in the Shiite tradition and in the Catholic tradition, we actually have an advantage to identify the pedagogical and hierarchical structures that guide the lives of practitioners on the ground on a day-to-day basis. What we're looking for here is, where is our authoritative discourse grounded? And in the Shiite tradition, we have the various marja taqlid, which are the sources of emulation, or the ayatollahs, who write in law and guide believers in a very direct way. And there's something very important to note here that we don't have within Sunni tradition, and we do have in some kind of parallel. Gabriel, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, whether we could make sense of this in the Catholic tradition versus the Protestant tradition, and that is a practitioner cannot take a ruling, a fatwa, in Shiite tradition from an Ayatollah that's passed away. They have to have a living Ayatollah in order to renew that fatwa and that edict. Even if it's the exact same ruling, it has to be issued by a living Ayatollah. And that tells me something about the Shiite tradition in terms of keeping the authoritative and interpretive hermeneutics of Islam alive through an authoritative source. And very much in Catholic tradition too, divine authority and sanctioned religious rights will come through the hierarchy of the church, much different than, let's say, a Protestant read in which somebody can just read directly, etc. And so I think if we start to pay attention to the structures of the teachings and the substances, we can triangulate better what our opportunities are to understand justice and geopolitics a bit better than simply walking in to an amazing ocean of tradition and saying, this is possible, this is possible, this is possible, and instead looking at what is viable and possible in the contemporary moment through living discourses. And so I'll pause there and love to hear some feedback on that.
Well, thank you very much. Before I say a few words about the geopolitical aspect of this question, I want to invite Gabriel to share with us his views of what Abbas just said.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your leadership with this Banafshe, and very happy to be with you, Emil and Abbas. I'll just briefly add a thought or two to that really lucid introduction to the question of, the question of how to be attentive to the larger structure of a Shiite Islamic worldview, which plays out in the work of jurisprudence, but also ethical direction. And in Catholicism, I think there is something analogous. We don't want to, of course, oversimplify just for the sake of dialogue. Sometimes dialogue can be about difference. But certainly a point that's often missed about Catholic teaching on ethics. It's not really my field, so someone can correct me in the Q&A, or if someone wants to push back. But something that's often overlooked is the question of what Catholic theologians call ecclesiology, so understanding the church. And, the Catholic vision of sort of God's guidance or direction of the world plays out not only in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, but also in his establishment of the church, which Catholic theologians would say, wasn't just for, the apostles, the first generation after Jesus, but was meant to be a manner in which God would continue to guide the world. And I think there is something roughly analogous to the vision of the imams first, but then later, and Abbas and Banafshe, you can clarify this as well, the understanding of religious teachers as marjas, as references or resources to which I believe individual Shiite Muslims are not just recommended, but obliged to follow in thinking through the way they live their lives as Muslims. So, in principle, Catholics should be attentive to what the church does. God continues to work through the church, and that's why you can have a council like, say, Vatican II, which to some outsiders, say Protestants, maybe atheists, but to some Muslims as well, might look like, what Muslims would call bid'ah, this innovation, like, why are you changing things so much? But there's this dynamism in Catholic understanding of the church, which, part of that dynamism is the continual renewal of the church, and that goes for ethical questions as well. I'll just stop there, Banafshe.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I'd like to, if I may, make a distinction here, which I think is necessary, between the elements of governance that theology superimposes on the way we manage the world around us as followers of the Catholic faith or the Shia faith, and the geopolitics, the actions that enable us to tie the dots between theology and our worldly interests, and then to advance power and security, which is at the core of geopolitics. And when I look at the Islamic world, and particularly the Shia world, from the perspective of geopolitics, I think that it's always been, geopolitics has always been part and parcel of the Islamic outlook on the world. From the beginning of, the advent of Islam, following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, we have different Muslim dynasties, Islamic dynasties emerge. The Umayyads, then the Abbasids, and it was during these dynasties that the 12-er Shias, the Ansari Shias, basically introduced their imams to the Shia world. I think that the Shias, as sort of a minority group, the Shia Ali, those who basically parted with the Sunni thought and parted and went their way, have always tried to incorporate an element of jihad, and within that, the definition of justice, to then explain why they are different and why they need to fight. Fight sometimes with the ruling system, and sometimes just go quiet. As Abbas was mentioning, there are quietist trends in it. But this concept of jihad and justice, and what it means in terms of the conception of power by the Shias as a minority, is therefore by definition geopolitics. So with that said, I'd like to pass the floor on to Gabriel so that you can please proceed with your thoughts as well as the second question, if you like.
Thank you so much, Banafsheh. With the second question, I'd like to turn to maybe a question which involves the vision of the state from a Catholic and then Shiite perspective, but more theoretically. So, within Catholic discourse, especially in the last 10, 20 years, there's a lot of chatter around this notion of integralism. So this idea that, the state is not just there to sort of manage things. This integralist vision is opposed to a classical liberal idea, where the state basically creates, guards boundaries, offers police and other necessary services, but stays out of sort of any ethical role. And so integralists would argue that, Catholic integralists would argue that, no, even this is not responsible for a state, in part because of the nature of humans individually and as a collective. You can't just leave humans on their own. They need guidance and maybe even more aggressive orientation towards the good and the beautiful and the just. And so the state should have a role in inculcating those things, goodness, beauty, justice, in things like the nature of public education, in things like potentially some sort of positive incentive for good behavior, and potentially penalties or punishment for bad behavior. So bringing together a little closer what is good and what is legal, and a little closer what is bad and what is illegal. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense, and Amelia, you can clarify me if I stumbled over some idea. In Islam, of course, there are analogous concepts. As I understand it, the state is, there are different visions and theories of the state as well, but there is the concept of al-amr bil-ma'ruf, which is used in many ways, but this commanding what is good. So maybe the state, maybe even individuals have that role. So I'll sort of leave it at there. The introduction was probably too long already, but Amelia, could you comment on that? Either your understanding of Islamic law or your knowledge of Catholic thinking on this question. How do people defend this idea of integralism or the state inculcating goodness, beauty, justice, and maybe introduce us to the other side, that the state should stay out of these things?
So in my opinion, the link between the secular and the religious in state governance is very contested one since ages. As Gabriel, as you noted, there are thinkers, policymakers, and the general part of the general population espouses the view that the organs of the state and the state itself should move away from imposing any sort of religious views or value-laden concept on the population. And of course, we have societies, and again, policymakers and part of general public that thinks otherwise. I think when we look at the global order, when we look at states who are the members of the global order, nowadays we see a variety of approaches to this. My research has been in this context of on the Islamic legal tradition. So Islamic law states espouse this view that part of their official domestic legal system is charged with obligatory implementation of Sharia, however is understood in the context of particular state and particular society. But yet those states are on the spectrum. We have states such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or Iran, whose legal system is largely imbued with those attempts to include some faith-based precepts into the official state framework. And then we have states like Malaysia, Indonesia that kind of their constitutions are largely secular. I believe the Constitution of Indonesia mentions God only once in a monotheistic general sense. So there's a spectrum of approaches to this. I think if I look at the domestic legal system, constitutional regimes and sub-constitutional regimes of non-Islamic states, we see similar arrangements. However, the language, the legal language used in constitutions or the sub-constitutional legal system, so legislation, pronouncements of the courts, is maybe aspirational. There are references to God, there are references to Jesus or other religious figures and beliefs, but this aspirational language is not put in the practice. So I think here the global order, domestic legal systems of different states provide us with a variety of arrangements in the context of the secular versus religious. I'm going to end with a quick comment by saying, by referring directly what you, Gabriel, so eloquently said, is that if we believe that the state has a role in shaping morality or encouraging good behavior and punishing bad behavior, this all is value-driven. And concepts such as good, bad, justice, or even peaceful resolution of disputes mean different things to different societies. And how that plays out in a reality really poses fundamental questions for the well-being of any human being. I'm going to end there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Powell. Right. So when you remind us that the theory, it's easy to sort of sit back and write an academic book or maybe record a video for YouTube about the theory of, religion and state and integralism, but actually how you carry this out in a state where people have different conceptions, even within a religious community. So among Catholics or among Shia Muslims, what is good, what is justice, then that's where it gets more complicated. Baz, feel free to comment, follow up on Amelia, but I also wanted to invite you to reflect on the Islamic idea that God's revelation in Quran, Hadith, reflects something about human nature, so that God, part of what God does, again, is open to your correction, but for most Muslim thinkers, part of what God does in Quran and Hadith is provide reasons for us to be attentive to Sharia, to God's guidance for how we live our lives. And God even sort of, some Muslims speak of the Quran as inculcating fear and instilling desire, fear of hell, desire for heaven. So behind that, it seems to me there's a kind of anthropology, which without that sort of, let's say, robust direction towards the good, towards the just, humans won't choose it on their own. And that could motivate a more robust sort of political theory about the role of the state and ethics. So anyway, feel free to comment on any aspect of that, Abbas, please.
No, thank you. Well, just on what you said there in terms of this sort of push and this kind of encouraging of mankind to move in a certain direction, I'm thinking now of a basic premise, and then I'll get to some issues about the state, and that is what is deemed to be human success in Islamic tradition. And if one thinks about just the call to prayer, hayya ala salah, hayya ala falah, which is to come to prayer and then come to, what is this word, falah, yufleh, to come to fruition, to come to success. And success here, meaning sort of coming into Islam and submitting to God. But the word fruition and growth, I think, is very telling because of what that means in terms of the imagery of heaven, but as well as just what the vision of humanity is, which is to grow into something that is productive, something that is beneficial, something that, as you can say, is just overall contributive to the overall ecosystem. And so when one thinks of the imagery of growth, of farming, of agriculture, of things like this, one sees human beings are directed to come to success in this way. And in many ways, I do believe that the Islamic political order is conceived in a way to bring about the very best in humanity in such a way, to cultivate success for human beings and society as a whole. So how is that accomplished? Now we have, again, a number of tools, a number of resources to look at that guide and inform what Islamic political governance theories look like, whether they're Shiite tradition or Sunni tradition. But one area that I think is instructive for us to think about in the context of dialogue, and like you alluded to just a moment ago, Gabriel, dialogue can be about difference, and it can be about sort of, juxtaposition of concepts. And here I'd like to juxtapose just two concepts I think that would be helpful in guiding these discussions. And the first is, in the Islamic tradition, the notion of hispa, which is a kind of regulation, the market supervisor, to make sure the muhtasab was the person who went and made sure that the weights and on the scales were accurate, and so that people were not being cheated. But hispa is also the notion of regulation of society. And so oftentimes we wonder what are the foundations and sort of premises of the right for governors and governance. And this notion of hispa is very well articulated in a number of different ways, and it touches on a number of different aspects of Islamic political thought. But if we carry it over to even any kind of Western political tradition whatsoever, we also get the notion that it is the job of the state to regulate. And it does regulate morality, and wherever that morality comes from, it may be a sort of diluted form of a religious based morality, but our contests in culture today in the United States, for example, our socio kind of political culture wars are largely based around an argument about what role the state should play in terms of hispa. And if you see the really kind of public debates, even if they don't have actual practical implication on the ground and they're exaggerated, I'm talking here about book bans, I'm talking here about questions around transgender rights within schools. The debates that take place in our public sphere that animate a lot of our political and cultural conversations revolve around the lack of hispa, or the need for a greater hispa, a need for a greater regulation. And so as we think about juxtaposing secular or secular Western or even Christian and Islamic traditions, we need to be able to identify those points that speak to the same type of concept, even if they come from different groundings. What are those similar conceptual frameworks that we can begin to understand, so that things like Sharia don't look so alien? It is not that odd for even a secular government like Egypt to every now and then come in and sort of demand regulation in a certain area around public morality, very much the same way that we do in Western tradition, and the configurations might take place in different ways. And so I think it's instructive and helpful to look at that. And then the final point that I want to make around Shia tradition and political power is something that could, again, require some more conversation, but that is to recognize that the Shiite tradition has largely been one that is aloof from political power. The historical tradition in fiqh and in theology has been to shun terrestrial sort of dunyawi power. And that is because of the hidden imam, that the true governor is just the hidden imam, and we would not have just rule until the return of the imam. So all governance and all sort of claims towards political legitimacy would be simply temporary. And although there would be some kind of striving towards that, especially during the times of the imams, after the occultation, the aspiration towards sort of worldly, kind of worldly domination, worldly governance in the Twelver tradition, let's not say in the Zaydi tradition or Ismaili tradition, but in the Twelver tradition has largely been quietist. That took a fundamental change underneath the introduction and sort of the introduction of, I should not say the introduction, but the sort of the flourishing of the concept of wilayat al-faqih in Iran under Imam Khomeini, which had already been, sort of in the works for a century and a half or so. And here, Imam Khomeini reintroduced the Jummah prayer. I think it's very important to recognize how significant this is. In Sunni tradition, it's mandatory to have the Jummah prayer, and there's no sultan or leader who could be considered to be politically legitimate without instituting the Friday prayer. In Shia tradition, there is a Friday congressional prayer, but it's actually just the afternoon prayer. It's just a Dhuhr prayer, okay? You pray 4 rakats and there's a speech, but that's not the actual Jummah prayer. Imam Khomeini introduced the Jummah prayer as Jummah prayer, which was a significant change in what the theological perspective is of the state of Iran. And so this marks a completely different tradition than the historical kind of quietist tradition within Shiite Islam. And these nuances might seem like not that big of a deal, but for believers and people that are adherents to these various traditions, these are fundamental pieces of understanding that I think are necessary for us to really have a proper engagement and a proper discussion.
Thank you so much, Abbas. I think it's really important for us to keep in mind, as you encourage us to do, that ultimately, although in a sort of public discourse, it might be more comfortable to just speak about, say, the ethical dimensions of Catholicism or Shiite Islam. These are religions which have their origin in divine revelation, and therefore believers are attentive to seeking God's will through all of this, and the ethics follow from that. You also introduce us to the term wilayat al-faqih, sometimes translated as a guardianship of the juris, consult. There's probably lots and lots we could say about that, but it's a really important reminder. I think in the American mind, there's often an idea that, Iran is sort of since the revolution, it is by its very nature, Shiite Iran, sort of political Islam. And actually, as you could speak more eloquently about this, Abbas, but actually, yeah, there's this important debate within Shiite Muslim thinkers between more quietist, less politically oriented thinkers and those who, like Khomeini, follow this idea of wilayat al-faqih. I want to make one brief comment, and then, if it's okay, Banafsheh, I'll ask you to follow up on either Amelia or Abbas's comments. So it's interesting for me to think through the question of the state's role in light of sort of the state's role in inculcating religious or ethical values, in light of sort of the opposite possibility, which is having no state. And there are real life experiments of this, different communes and things. I mean, they're actually kind of mini communes throughout the US. I mean, in American history, in early American history, in a sense, that's what the pilgrims were at, the initial colony in Massachusetts. And then you have sort of theoretical explorations of this idea, famously the book, The Lord of the Flies. What happens when you have no law, just people doing things on their own. In a way, in the Islamic tradition, the book Hayy ibn Yaqzan sort of explores that. Oh, there's only one and then two people on the island. But also, interesting, the thought of Leo Tolstoy. I shouldn't go down that road because I won't stop talking, but Tolstoy established somewhat of a commune at the end of his life as well around his ideas. Okay, enough of me. Banafsheh, follow-ups to Amelia or Abbas, and then we can turn it over to you for the third question.
Thank you, Gabriel, and to all our speakers. I really enjoyed your responses to this question. I have a couple of thoughts I'd like to share very briefly. The first is to follow up on what Amelia mentioned about the relevance of law and its conception, for example, in Shia societies, as well as the Islamic world, in a manner that applies to all citizens. It is a struggle in the case examples of countries like Saudi Arabia, but in the Shia world, it's also a struggle. I come from Iran, and there's always a constant battle between what the law says in Islam and what the citizens of Iran want. And so for that reason, you might be interested to know, Amelia, that in recent months, there are calls for Shia reforms, Shia reformist agenda that will also apply to law, and a Shia renaissance to really better attract citizens to the cause of Shiism and a Shia state, in the case example of countries like Iran. And I know that in other Shia countries like Bahrain, they have, since the Arab Spring, gone through some remodeling of the conception of the relationship between civil society and state, in which case civil society comprises a large group of Shias as well. With that said, because our dialogue is about geopolitics, I want to shift the debate a little bit and remind ourselves that state and Shia Islam are intertwined from the beginning. In the case of Persia in the 16th century under the Safavids, there would never have emerged the modern Shia nation state of Persia had not the clerics, the Shias, who had become Shias and then converted a large population of Persia at that time into Shiism, not come together with the Safavid Empire to then allow the new Persian state to rise and protect itself from invasive Turkish armies as well as Arab armies. And there's a whole history that we're over there that we're familiar with. But since that time, since the 16th century, the Shia clerics in Iran have believed that they have played an integral role in the preservation of nationhood in modern Iran. And that role has time and again emerged in various religiously inspired movements that a country like Iran has had in the 19th century. There were a couple of movements, the tobacco movement, movements against the British Empire's attempts to control Iran's oil in the late 19th century, 1890 onwards, way before Iran's oil nationalization. Some 60 years later. So the clerics have always believed that they have played an important role in establishing, for example, the Shia world's presence in the larger geopolitics of the Muslim world and in the larger geopolitics of the Muslim world's relationship with colonial powers of the time. Fast forward, since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, this has taken on a new definition, meaning that, yes, as Abbas said, there's a certain aloofness to temporal and material power in a worldly sense in Shia Islam. But the leaders of Iran, for example, believe that they must preserve Iran in order to protect its resources, in order to then elevate the Shia cause in the larger Muslim world. That, by definition, is geopolitics. So I believe that we really have to remind ourselves of how faith systems interact in advancing geopolitical goals. And that said, unless someone wants to say something, please let me know. If not, I'm happy to ask the third question. But I want to ask if you have any thoughts about this and geopolitics at large.
I could jump in briefly.
Sure, please.
To pick up on that note about the role of the clerics at a particular time in contemporary history, but also just to think about the sort of hypothetical question that Gabriel posed, and that is, what does governance look like in the absence of a state, or what does sort of religion and ethics look like, and law look like in the absence of a state? And this question came up as a type of test question in the mid-19th century in Najaf, amongst ulama, who began to question and play with the tradition again of wilaya, which is a very broad concept, but one might think about in terms of governance or rule and whatnot. And the question that was posed by Ayatollah Shirazi in the 19th century, and that was picked up again throughout the 20th century, and then by Khomeini himself, was, who is responsible for the orphan in the absence of a state or a family or anything? Who is responsible for the orphan, considering the weight of the role of an orphan and the rights of an orphan that the Quran and the Hadith speak about? And the conclusion was that it was the ulama, and because in normal circumstances, it would be the jurisdiction of the Sharia, which is governed by and maintained by the ulama. And so this test question serves as a kind of basis for what wilaya looks like. And it's through that wilaya, or that sort of authoritativeness and that authoritative role, that we do get things that like the tobacco protest movement that was mentioned here. If one looks at the tobacco protest movement, it's a phenomenal moment in modern history, I believe, for religion, for states, for anti-colonialism. And if, I tried very much to go and identify what were the sort of usul of fiqh, premises of the tobacco boycott and the protest, and what was the sort of authority of the fatwa. And the authority of the fatwa, if you go back and look at it, wasn't based in a complex ruling about tobacco or a complex ruling about sort of, states and sovereignty or anything like that. It was just a very sort of authoritative statement that the Ayatollah says, this is what is going to happen now with tobacco because of the rights that it infringes upon us as a nation. And it worked, and it was operative. And I think this is the most critical piece, is that as we talk about reform, as we talk about changes in Islamic law, geopolitics, we have to think about what is the functional and operative discourse, and what are those structures, and not necessarily just the substances and themes, but who's responsible and capable of making such changes. And I think that's where we can start thinking about the kind of practical theology that unfolds before us every day, and the opportunities that exist every day for us in terms of cooperation and dialogue, between different traditions. If we just look at what's actually happening on the ground already, and then draw upon those discourses to engage in a sort of very kind of hands-on, in the trenches way.
Thank you, Abbas. And just again to that point, it's not just in Iran that we see trends like this emerging, but and have for a very long time. But take the example of the role that Ayatollah Sistani plays in Iraq, and his ability to mobilize Iraqis, for example, to fight ISIS, or in the case of Lebanon, from the perspective of where we sit in America, Hassan Nasrallah is a terrorist, was a terrorist leader. But when you speak to people on the ground in Lebanon, some over there have also regarded him at times, not always, a unifying factor in mobilizing the Lebanese against certain incursions of a geopolitical nature. And I won't get into the details of that. But I think the power of the Shia faith lies in its ability to mobilize the people within the nation state and transnationally. But with that said, I like to ask the third question here. What does the term Shia geopolitics mean to you? Is it a faith-based geopolitical order? Is it about resistance against oppression? How can it be made relevant to approaching the subject of building peace across faiths? And I'd like to invite Amelia to respond to this first.
Okay, thank you. This is a great question because it deals with broad understanding of the relationship between, let's say, a faith tradition and geopolitics. So to me, when I saw this question, I thought, well, that's a big problem, I would say, to answer it in one way. Number one, kind of broadening the scope here. Do we even have Islamic geopolitics? And, I think that a lot of this formulation of Islamic international law Islamic view of geopolitics, or even going deeper and contrasting, let's say, a Sunni or Shia or Ibadi view of geopolitics. It's a very contested issue. Why is it? First of all, the Muslim world has been really unable to signal to the non-Muslim world what is Islamic international law. What is Islamic geopolitics? This has been an ongoing conversation since the 70s and the 80s. I can give some examples. In the 80s, the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, voted to birth the International Islamic Law Commission. And the aim of this commission was to present the Islamic point of view between the International Court of Justice and other such institutions and organs of the United Nations. So to present literally the Islamic views of geopolitics in the context of international law. And what happened till this day is a lofty idea. The same happened in the latter part of the 80s. This idea was, why doesn't the Muslim world construct Islamic International Court of Justice? So equivalent of the UN judicial organ, International Court of Justice, would be an Islamic version. Again, a lofty idea. So what does it tell me? The Islamic world has been really unable to tell the non-Islamic world in a credible way what is Islamic international law. I think it's a crisis of authority in the Islamic legal tradition and faith tradition in the context of signaling a unified version on geopolitics. Now, we can say, okay, this is about the Shia geopolitics. So I'll give you a brief answer on this. I have analyzed, looking at Iran's attitude and preferences in the context of, I think, 12 international treaties. And I analyzed whether Iran has signed and ratified a treaty, such as, let's say, Convention on Rights of Women, Convention on the Rights of the Child, World Trade Organization, International Court of Justice, accepting jurisdiction and so forth. And what do I see? If I contrast Iran as a Shia state, arguably, with other Islamic law states, I see no difference. Iran doesn't even place many reservations on its international commitments. There is one notable one, is Convention on the Rights of the Child, that Iran signed in 91, ratified in 94. And Iran placed a reservation that says that issues will arise if any text of the convention is incompatible with Islamic law and Islamic legislation. So, it's hard to identify Shia geopolitics. I think it's a concept that's debatable, that's far from being clear, but it falls in line with the larger Islamic geopolitics. This is a discourse that characterized by dissonance. And I think the same we can say about Shia geopolitics.
Thank you, Amelia. Those are very profound talks, and I subscribe to a lot of what you have said, because that really does explain the confusion within the Shia world about where it stands when it tries to navigate the world of international law while asserting its own understanding of the international legal order. With that said, I want to pass the floor on to Abbas to hear what he has to say, please.
Yeah, I think if the question is focused upon, first, the idea that a state can take on a Shia identity, we really do sort of limit ourselves to, to the Iranian example. And so we don't really have much data there. And so if we think about geopolitics just in terms of state actors, then again, we really are limiting ourselves. But if we broaden the scope a bit to think about the historical continuity of religious communities and religious traditions, especially those that are Shiite, in a region that has only recently, on a historical perspective, adopted the state model, these states are new. They're not, these states are very new. And so the notion of geopolitics being confined to the state, I think, limits us. And so is there a Shia geopolitics? Yes, there always has been. If you look at this from the perspective of empire and the transformation of empire into states, we have seen transnational Shiite communities operating across the entire sort of MENA and South Asian region from the time that we have colonial sort of modern history and even before. And so geopolitics in the Shia tradition has always been sort of confined again to the networks of ulama and the marja taqlid. And what's important to point out here is that those politics are not simply moral and ethical. These are not communities that are just moral and ethical communities. These are actually communities that have resources. They collect taxes, and they redistribute those taxes across networks of schools, charitable institutions, and other forms of sort of pseudo governance, if you will. And so one wants to think here then about those nodes of authority and those networks of ulama that have been collecting taxes and redistributing them, and how that's operated across state boundaries. As far as the kind of, discourse of Shiite revival or Shiite, geopolitics, I will just make a note that, in the mid 2000s and sort of early 10s, the question was at the forefront of DC circles because of what was happening in Iraq. And so at the time, the term the Shiite crescent or the Shiite revival was really had a lot of parlance and circulation within DC circles, mostly out of a kind of a fear of Iranian influence. And I think that there's a very important point to look at there. But I think thinking just about that in terms of the contemporary context or even the state context misses the wider scope about what these structures of Shia tradition really bring to the table in terms of our understanding of the last few centuries, if not further.
Yes, thank you very much, Abbas, for sharing those thoughts. Before I pass the floor on to Gabriel, I'd like to, if I may, make a few comments here. I think that basically we can't ignore the fact that the term Shia geopolitics has been emerging. Now, whether it is whether the Shia leaders have a full conception of what it means is debatable, a point that Amelia kind of indirectly referred to by trying to apply it to the understanding of the Shia world of what international law is. But there have been transnational elements of how the Shias have aimed to connect and unite and mobilize the resources of the nation in order to therefore advance the Shia cause, which then relates to the reemergence of the hidden Imam Mahdi, as well as a companion of Jesus toward the end of time. So that we kind of already know. I want to also answer the second part of the question, which is how the concept of Shia geopolitics, as loosely defined as it is, may relate to the concept of geopolitical order. Because in the Western conception of geopolitics, we often tend to try to establish an order. We also fail, and we're not as quick to really point the fingers at ourselves and say we failed to establish that order. But God Almighty knows when we do want to establish an order, we go in with big armies all across the globe to do that. Now, in the Shia world, they're trying to readdress that order and say, well, this order might be imperialistic. And is there another way of approaching this order? And then in the case of a country like Iran, it prefers a disorder, if no order, in which the Shia countries have a say can emerge. And that order in their conception of geopolitics is a just order. So again, we kind of go back in a circle to the concept of justice that Amelia brought up first. And I want to ask if Gabriel might be willing to please inform us a little bit about whether a similar struggle of conception of justice and order prevails in the Catholic world, and how, through your knowledge, you can connect that with the Shia conceptions of these concepts, basically these ideas, and then say a few words, wrap our session, or let us know if you have a final question beforehand, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Banafsheh. I do have a few thoughts about this from sort of the history of Christian, both Protestant and Catholic political thought. although it's not my territory. So, people might want to push back or correct me inevitably I'll make some blunders, but I'm really interested in this question. So I'd like to say a thing or two about that, and then I will invite people to reflect on just our panelists to reflect on one last question. So, it's important to note that sometimes from even European perspectives, looking at U.S. political discourse, there's this idea that, the U.S. is highly religious and informed by maybe even biblical ideas in the way it makes laws and advances policies. So without commenting on, say, 2025, if we look back at the history of the American experiment, it's just important to remind ourselves that actually, the founding of the United States and its initial political philosophy was in some ways a radical departure from the Christian heritage of Europe. And of course, it anticipates and in some ways gives a theoretical a basis for the French Revolution, which is even more radical in 1789. So behind the American ideas articulated in the Declaration of Independence are the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers. Many of whom are French, so there's kind of a circle, France, US, back to France. But, folks like Voltaire and Rousseau, they strongly argued for a government around the idea of the consent of the governed. So I think Voltaire was famous for saying something like, I may disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to my death your right to say it. So there's this idea that individual liberty, but also that the state, consequently, its principal responsibility is attentiveness to the will of the governed. And this is very radical stuff because, Catholic teaching, a place like France historically, was that, humans in the end understand what is good and beautiful and just from God, from divine revelation. And now humans seem to produce for themselves from their own will what is good, beautiful, just, and all the other stuff. So, but that latter concept was really embraced by the almost, without exception, Protestant founding fathers of the United States. And in many ways, I think that still actually is sort of at the center of how most Americans think about politics, including geopolitics. It's not actually opening a chapter of the Bible. It's, the consent of the people. Now, just to turn to Catholics for a second and just to give one really interesting example of a response to the American and then the even more radical French experiment of the French Revolution. After the incredible catastrophe of World War II and the ongoing catastrophe of communism in the Soviet Union and in China and other places, the response of certain Catholic thinkers in Europe, the most famous may be the German Konrad Adenauer, who became a chancellor of West Germany, who was a devout Catholic, was that, it's neither that the state is in direct cooperation with the church and the bishops, nor the American model, but based on, the recent thinking, social thinking of the Catholic Church, a famous encyclical Rerum Novarum and others, which speak about the responsibility of a state to promote the good for all of its citizens, regardless of belief or non-belief. They developed basically sort of, a vision of Catholic state craft, which led to the foundation of the CDU in Europe, in Germany, which still exists today, of course, and it was something very similar in Italy as well with the Democratic Christian Party. So Italy has gone all over the place since then. Anyway, the vision was embracing the good of a market economy, but always with the protective role of the state to guard the rights of vulnerable members, including minorities. The problem, this returns us to an earlier point, the problem of World War II, both with the Bolshevik Revolution that led to the Soviet Union, and then subsequent events similar in China, but also with fascism, both in Italy and in Germany, of course, more dramatically, was that, if you leave everything to the will of the people, what if that will goes awry through destructive ideologies which do not protect the rights of minorities or others. So anyway, there's that, a little bit of commentary from some developments in Catholic thought. And then finally, I have one question about contemporary geopolitics, things going on right now. We have a question also in the Q&A, which I think we can get to too. Maybe after I ask my question, Banafsheh, I'll invite you to ask that one. And others watching are free to add questions through the Q&A button. Amelia, I wanted to ask specifically about conflict resolution. You've worked extensively on this question. Your book with Oxford University Press and other recent publications address this question. You work principally in Islamic law, but I'd like to ask generally about, when we see now, as Professor Mirza mentioned, the U.S. and Iran have had direct conversations, but there's also a lot of political negotiations that have gone on in the MENA region. In some ways, Iran and Saudi Arabia, principal actors, and have tried to come to agreements in other countries. In Iraq, in Lebanon, and in Syria. Turkey is increasingly playing a role as well. In all of this geopolitics going on in the Middle East between Islamic states, we might think of Afghanistan as well. Does religious thought actually play a role? Or is this all just sort of window dressing, just, to make people feel like there's religious motivations and it's just realpolitik calculations that are going back and forth? What do you see as the religious role in conflict resolution?
So I think that's a great question, Gabriel. Thank you for it. I think the very important thing that we have to keep in mind is that Islamic law states, as I call them, they are members of the global order, which is some form of pattern behavior, codified, uncodified, but there's a normative framework for the global order, including peaceful resolution of disputes and behavior during war and peace. So there are processes of socialization of Islamic law states or of the Islamic legal tradition in the modern global order. And I don't think many people would dispute with me saying that the modern global order, international law, international organizations, and even the unwritten, uncodified norms and rules of pattern international behavior are constructed and executed according to Western legal thinking, Western appreciation of concepts such as justice, interstate relations, peace, war, and so forth. So if we think about the global order in contrast to the Islamic legal tradition and first tradition, we have to realize that Islamic law states are players and crucial actors in the global order according to the characteristics that it has. So what does that mean? Is that socialization processes of Islamic law states or of the Islamic legal tradition vis-a-vis international law and the Western or international, as we say, norms of interstate behavior, this socialization is limited. What I observe in my research and just this everyday following of news is that Islamic law states have socialized to the global order as it is, but this socialization has limitations. And we see those limitations across some substantive areas, such as human rights or international criminal law. Now, in the context of peaceful resolution of disputes, what is the role of religious precepts of Islam? I think there is this long-standing belief in the Islamic faith and legal tradition in non-confrontational dispute resolution. This is something that we see throughout the history of the Islamic legal tradition. So then if two Islamic law states or Muslim majority countries, however one prefers, if those two countries have a dispute, they will lean toward the non-confrontational dispute resolution. And this is where we see, as you said, Gabriel, Turkey, Qatar, I would like to add Oman, also the Sultanate of Oman, trying to mediate, trying to provide good offices for conflicts, not only among two Islamic law states, but also in the non-Islamic world. This is this approach of the Islamic legal tradition that embraces sulh, all the non-confrontational dispute resolution.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Abbas, I'd like to introduce another topic for you, but of course, feel free to circle back to the question of conflict resolution, something that people might observe in the way things have unfolded in the Middle Eastern region is, as you alluded to, especially in the 2010s, there was a lot of interest in this notion that, everything that's unfolding is about a Sunni-Shia conflict, and that Iran has a sort of patronage role for especially Shiite minorities. So we don't have to speak about the actual, current events and speculate on, how Iran determines its policy, but the place of Shia as significant minorities in countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, not really numerically minorities in Iraq or Lebanon, but they have historically suffered injustice with the other communities. And maybe most notably in Saudi Arabia, people forget there's a significant Shia minority in Saudi Arabia. So I don't know if you want to comment on sort of Shiite, the legacy of Shiite oppression, or just the challenges for Shia living in those sorts of states, and or commentary on the Middle East region, which just sees sort of these conflicts in light of a Sunni Shiite divide.
Thank you, Gabriel. Just a quick note on conflict resolution, and that is that again, if we look at things from a state level, we might get predictable results. But if we look at a sub-state level, especially around areas where there are fragile states or conflict zones where there are no states or states in transition, et cetera, which happens to govern a lot of the parts of the world that we're interested in, what we find is that the only possible peacemakers tend to be the religious authorities, both in the Shiite context and a non-Shiite context, and in a Muslim context. It is the religious leadership that sort of is the default governance structure. And so it's been about 20 years or so I've been advocating for policymakers to pay better attention to those different types of religious structures, whether they're kind of Shiite communities underneath different Maraja, or if they are Sufi communities, or whether they're sort of Sunni movements of different sorts, to really kind of pay a nuanced attention to what those structures look like. And I think that when we look there, we might find many more sort of unpredictable or unexpected outcomes around conflict resolution, interreligious, and even sort of intersectarian sort of cooperation. And again, those are the living traditions that I think that we should do more anthropology on and engage further for resource building towards peace. As far as sort of the legacy of Shiite communities as a minority and oppressed kind of community, I believe that, over the last 50 years or so, a little bit more, the Shiite tradition has taken on this posture through a combination of formal ulama as well as sort of popular intellectuals like, let's say, Ali Shariati and others, that they have taken on. The Shiite tradition has taken on a tradition and a kind of color of resistance to oppression, and that oftentimes that resistance to oppression is in the form of a kind of anti-colonial discourse blended with a religious discourse that draws upon classical narratives like the martyrdom of Imam Hussein as an archetypical sort of symbol for what resistance and governance can and should look like. That then has become popularized in ways that even extend outside of Shiite tradition. And I think that's what's really important to pay attention to. And even if, and admittedly so, it has been the Iranian government that has sort of been exporting that image and has been cultivating that image to make allies with even non-Muslim sort of allies in the anti-colonial resistance. I think that we have to recognize that that is a viable discourse, that is an operative discourse, and that is an attractive one for people in many, many parts of the world. And so I think it's illustrative to note that, again, if one were to look at the Shia tradition just 200 years ago, one would not be able to predict that all of a sudden, somebody like Ali Shariati would be blending, Fanonian anti-colonial thought with a reconstruction of mysticism and the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. I think that amalgamation of ideas is a very interesting one, and that we should sort of understand how that plays out in culture across various spaces. Just to sort of put a note on that, Gabriel.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Abbas. And then Banafshi, I'll turn things over to you. There is a question from Sayyid Nouri in the Q&A, and so and then Professor Mirza may have a question as well.
Thank you very much. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and we still have a way to go to really understand what a just conception of a world order might be that would lead to peace from our understanding of the Shia world as well as the Catholic world. Just resistance, the concept of resistance is inherent within the Shia political thought system. And it's also important to recognize that it's not just in the Shia world, but pretty much the Shia clerics have always tried to reach out to Sunni leaders as well, to invite them to share a dialogue on these concepts in an effort to fight imperialism or colonialism since the early 20th century and way before, a little bit before that as well. So with that said, we do have a question from an audience member, Dr. Nouri, who wants our panelists to discuss the relevance of the meeting that Pope Francis held with Grand Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq. I believe it was in March 2021. And how is that relevant to our discussion today about geopolitics and order? And that will be followed by a question that Dr. Mohan Mirza wants to ask as well, I believe. So with that said, I'll just pass the floor on to our panelists to discuss the first question of the Pope's visit to Iraq and meeting with Ayatollah Osman Sistani, and then ask Mohan to please conclude with his final words and questions. Thank you very much.
I could start with a few words there about the meeting between Ali Sistani and Pope Francis. And I know better sort of the recent thought of Pope Francis on the religions generally, and the Catholic Church's relationship with non-Christian communities. And it's based strongly in a view of a natural law or natural theology. This is very strong in Catholic theological thought. I understand it's also very strong in Shiite thought. So I'd be interested to hear more about how others would see this. So just as a reminder, the resources that Catholic thinkers have in their understanding of God and God's relationship to humanity are not limited to, let's say, Bible and church tradition, but include rational reflection, reasonable reflection of all of the arts and sciences. So understanding the natural world, geology and everything else, cosmology, and also understanding the human person, psychology, understanding what the conscience is. And Pope Francis really emphasizes that this is a resource which is not just accessible to non-Christians, but which is shared by all humans. And this has motivated his engagement both with Sunni thinkers like Ahmed Tayyib at Al-Azhar and then Sistani in Iraq, that this can be a basis for fundamental understandings of religious thinkers of the human person and human rights.
Thank you very much for that input. Amelia, Abbas, would you like to add to this conversation?
I'm just going to add a broad thought that anytime we have two religious leaders meeting in a positive way, it's a good thing for the global order and for the world peace. It's a symbolic thing that conflict and maybe disagreement on important and peripheral issues can be resolved peacefully via dialogue. It's a wonderful symbol.
I just want to comment quickly that that both Ayatollah Sistani and Pope Francis, that meeting was made possible by the precedent that each one of them have set up on their declarations, understandings, and interpretations of how interreligious dialogue should unfold, and not just dialogue, excuse me, but what members of the other religious communities deserve in terms of rights, dignity, protection by one another. And so these two institutions are the ones setting up precedents for what ethical behavior and even legal behavior and obligations should look like in their respective communities. So Sistani's, Sistani was approached by Pope Francis because he had a longstanding tradition of already protecting Christians in Iraq and already making that possible, especially during the kind of crises that Iraq went through. And so, again, cultivating those living traditions will be a place for us to build positive momentum and resources for peace building.
Thank you very much, Amelia, Abbas, and Gabriel. I also just want to conclude with these thoughts that I think that the Catholic world and the Muslim world and the Shia world have still a lot to do by way of dialogue. And just coming from the Shia world, I think that their conception and understanding of the role of the Catholic Church is quite narrow. They might focus on the Vatican, but often, although they are aware of it, they don't think actively about the fact that there are Catholics all over the world, and that the Catholic Church has been interacting with the developing world and the Catholics in the developing world who have themselves been victims of colonialism, imperialism, poverty, injustices of a global nature, and that the Catholic Church does indeed have a wealth of history and experience to share with these Shia thought leaders on all these fronts. So I do hope that this meeting between the Pope and Ayatollah Sistani will be the beginning of very many more important ones to come. With that said, Mohan, I'd like to pass the floor on to you. And before I do that, thank everyone very much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you indeed. I mean, this was incredible, and I just feel like we've touched on the surface. And although this is the last in this series, it's probably the beginning, marks what could be a beginning of a much deeper engagement on geopolitics, on faith-based peace building. There's something very counterintuitive here, religion, at least in the popular understanding, and particularly when it comes to geopolitics, is typically seen as a problem. But we're ending on a note where, we see great faith leaders that are actually a hope for peace. And it's often realpolitik, the power conversations that take place in a very a-religious, material plane that leads to zero-sum games and ultimately perhaps annihilation. I have a question before we end, so I hope that's okay if I can ask it. And it's maybe a provocative question, so raising it at the end. But I think it's something that probably should get out. And I hope that the conversations on, justice, just geopolitical orders, integralism that we touched upon, questions of commanding good and forbidding evil that the Catholic and Islamic and Shia traditions have in common, that we can deepen those in future engagement. My question is the following. When we think of Shia geopolitics, and this is not as much for me, but I think for our audience. Okay, so bear with me. We have the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah that was already mentioned, Iran, with which the United States is just entering into dialogue, but with which diplomatic relations have been severed since the 1980s. And where I'm sitting, these are all seen as bad actors. And what they want to destroy Israel. There's a sense that if we let them, if we talk to them, that everything they believe in is antithetical to what we believe in. And given the framework of justice that we've been talking about today, I mean, these lofty ideals, how can we better understand the positions that are misrepresented here for sure, but that are experienced, with certain narratives and understood through certain narratives. How can we better understand what is happening in the world through that network of largely Shia, geopolitics? Is there someone who would like to comment on this?
I would actually like to invite everyone to say a few words briefly about this because it's a very powerful question and it deserves a powerful response. So I'd like to start with Amelia, if you're comfortable, please.
Yes, I think that the solution to this misunderstanding of nature of actors or misunderstanding of Islam or any other legal or faith tradition is the lack of knowledge. The non-Muslim world perceives Islam as a monolith, and the overwhelming perception, at least that has been my experience, that each Muslim majority state or Islamic law states is identical, that really Muslims live mainly in the Gulf. So there is just a swath of misperceptions fueled by lack of knowledge. And I mean, how do we solve this? On individual level, we need to share the knowledge, objective knowledge, without the narratives that impose some value-driven beliefs onto interpretations of facts. So that's one. Two, I think it's quite difficult because of the conflation between a legal or faith tradition and politics of the real world and the contested relationship between state and religion as practiced by certain actors or within a state. And then people are more likely to misunderstand, and the religion is more likely to be misrepresented if its legitimacy is being used by the state.
Thank you very much. Abbas?
I think when it comes to the Shiite geopolitical order, the message that I've been trying to get across, again, to policymakers for, since the U.S. invasion of Iraq really, has been that Shiite movements are representative movements. They have constituencies, they have communities, they have governing structures, they have institutions, and they are not simply, even if they are militarized, and they have goals that are antithetical to let's say U.S. or certain Israeli interests and whatnot, that even if they have those goals, these are not, and even if they're militarized, these are not the same type of pedigree of institutions that we're talking about when we talk about ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other types of radical Islamic movements. These have governing structures, they have constituents, communities, and even if they are minorities, within minorities, they still represent millions and millions of people and billions of dollars, and they sit on very, very important geopolitical spaces. And it's interesting that the folks who understood this message the most have always been people that are involved in some kind of military context. So it's much easier to get this message across to officials in the Pentagon than it is the State Department. Why? Because it's what matters. It's what constitutes the possibilities of peace. And I remember one military official telling me, and this was about Afghanistan, he said, we don't really care what folks believe. We just care if they respect us and if they respect order and they respect sort of, a process and a transaction. And I think what needs to be understood in terms of the Shiite sense, whether you're dealing with the Houthis, Iranian-backed militias, etc., whoever they might be, is that there are command and control centers that are backed by reliable structures, and that there are theological doctrines and principles that guide those structures, and that provides the opportunity for engagement. And so when you go into a peace conversation or a dialogue around deconfliction or ceasefire or whatever that might be, we do not want to sort of trap ourselves into thinking in the beginning, we can't make peace with so-and-so because they believe in XYZ. The whole point of engaging in a process like that is for exploration, is to be open up to possibilities for next steps. And I think right now, when you have a possible peace discussion taking place between the United States and Iran, right now is absolutely the time to bolster and augment that process through a robust discussion with theological leaders, with sort of civil society leaders, humanitarian leaders, to make sure that that kind of engagement, if it produces anything, doesn't remain just in the level of the sort of statecraft, but instead we can bolster it and augment it with some kind of engagement at the level of civil society, academia, and otherwise. And so I hope, again, as you said, Mahan, that this is, although it's the end of this series, that it's the beginning of a much larger discussion.
Thank you very much, Abbas. Gabriel, would you like to say a few words?
All I have to say is I'm very grateful for the insights on this question of both Amelia and Abbas, and thank you, Banafsheh, again for your leadership of this series. Thank you to Professor Mirza and Rebecca and everyone at Ansari.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to thank our panelists. To do justice to the question that Mahan raised, I do want to say that from experience working in the Muslim world and on the question of geopolitics, it's my understanding that the more isolated we make them feel, the more ideological they become. And ideology and politics across nations and world systems have always gone hand in hand. But the purpose of isolating a country because of its belief systems will do us a disservice in terms of understanding them better. Take, for example, the hot case of Iran's potential nuclear weaponization. I can tell you from firsthand primary research that I've conducted in the country that the country has struggled and still continues to struggle with the question of weaponization precisely because of its ideological and religious leanings. Besides realpolitik factors that tell the state that it might need a nuclear weapon to protect the Islamic Republic of Iran, the vast majority of Shia theologians are against weaponization because it believes that it just does not comply with the tenets of Shia Islam and the Islamic belief system. And they refer to many hadiths from the time, you might be interested to know, from the time of the Prophet to discourage weaponization when Iran actually has the capability to weaponize within hours. And I think that engagement and the current dialogue is essential. But again, as Abbas was saying, it shouldn't be with the purpose of isolating, but really understanding that isolating will only add to the ideational aspects of the foreign policy of the Muslim world and may not serve the goals of peace and justice. But thank you all very much for your profound contributions to this dialogue. We're very grateful for your time and expertise, and I'll just pass the closing part of this session to Mahan.
I know Gabriel has to run, so very, very quickly, I want to thank Gabriel, for stepping up, despite I know how busy you are in helping to co-lead this series, to Banafsheh for taking the initiative, to inviting us, and today to Abbas and Emilia for your presence and your wisdom and your scholarship. The last point I think you made really illustrates this. And I don't think many people understand this. The theologians are pulling away from nuclearization because the theology says such weapons should be forbidden. The realpolitik is driving towards it, and there's the contrast. And where religion and theology can actually pull us back from the brink. And so what a beautiful illustration, and go in peace, and may this conversation only continue for the greater good. Thank you all.